As the rector has just said, so we are not looking only at Estonia today. We are not focusing on Estonia only today. Instead, we are taking a broader look, and in the first part of our seminar, we ask the question, what can we learn from other European countries? And to do so, we have presenters to tell us about this. Given that during the seminar today, we are using both Estonian and English, then everybody can use interpretation equipment. They'll translate interpretation from Estonian to English and vice versa all the time. And all the presentations will also be broadcast through Facebook Live and in the university internal web as well. And the presentations can be viewed afterwards, later as well. But let's now get down to business. The first speaker today is going to give us a broader picture on European level. And we'll ask the question whether this is, because this is not only the Estonian problem, we'd like to know what is happening in Europe when it comes to funding, science and reporting, and where Estonia stands at this point and what we can learn from this. So we have Director for Governance, Funding and Public Policy Development of the European University Association, Thomas Estermann.
Since this is not an issue which is somehow specific to us here in Estonia, but it has a very much a wider European dimension, please, Thomas, could you come and tell us what is the big picture in Europe in terms of funding and auditing? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and Director Aaviksoo, Rector Klassen, members of the Estonian academic community and other participants. It's a great pleasure for me to be here back in Estonia. I've already been here several times, and I remember very well when that was in 2012 or 13, when we had an event also talking about funding issues. There it was more on developing appropriate costing systems. And that was a follow-up actually from the work that I had the pleasure to start the UA quite a long time ago, and it was actually Rector Aaviksoo who introduced as a board member of EUA this topic that EUA should follow that. And I think you have been very successful because it's still going strong as an important topic that we've looked at over more than a decade now. We've done lots of research, we've done lots of comparative studies, and from that work I would like to share the experience today and also provide a little bit the bigger picture, because in the end it is really about two keywords that we've heard in the introduction from Rector Aaviksoo. It's about trust and it's about efficiency. So what I'm trying to do is show you a couple of key elements how in a system trust and efficiency can be established. I can't cover everything in half an hour, but I think we also have time in an exchange. So I will start a little bit from the bigger picture, and the bigger picture starts in understanding what is a hugely complex funding environment for universities. That's not specific to Estonia, that's the case in all European higher education systems. So I will talk a little bit about that. Then I think it's also important to understand the trends in these areas. So I will share a little bit what's happening in other European systems at national level, but also at European level. And I will zoom in very briefly into Estonia and then highlight what we believe are appropriate frameworks for universities so that they can actually act efficiently and effectively. And what, sort of on the part of the institutions, what are the key conditions and what institutions can do to achieve that trust. I will build on some of the work that we've been doing at UA. So here you see some of our studies. It's about designing efficient funding systems. We also have our public funding observatory where we monitor development of funding in over 30 European higher education systems. And we've done a lot of work on accounting practices, simplification, and just very recently also a study on developing appropriate auditing framework. So if you're interested in some more details, all of these studies are available. There you will also find quite a lot of detail. Now, this here is a simplified structure of how universities are funded. So you can see the main part here comes from public authorities, but already there we have very different ways and very different funding streams coming to universities. So the block grants, you have targeted funding, you have project-based funding, so very often coming from research funders, competitive sources. You have contracts, specific contracts. So that is already the public funding part, highly complex. And many of these types of funding sources, you have numerous funding within these blocks. Then you have European funding from Horizon Europe, for example, structural funds. You have other international funding coming from philanthropic sources. Then there's funding coming from business and industry in various different forms, tuition fees, and foundations and charities and other sources. Okay, these are just the categories. And in our several studies, we've seen that universities very often have more than 300 different funding streams. So this is important to understand that this is not an easy undertaking, and because very often these different funding streams have very different rules, very different reporting rules, accountability rules, so that's why it is very, very complex. So actually, universities are some of the most complex funded institutions existing. Another part to see a little bit how the funding looks like across Europe. This is some data from our public funding observatory, where we collect data on funding towards universities on a yearly basis. And here you see two figures. The green bars show the development of funding between 2008 and 2017. And next to it, we have development of student numbers. It's just one element of costs of universities. But here you have the category of 16 European higher education systems that have invested in the time. But if you already look at the development of student numbers, sometimes the investment doesn't look that's important, because you had a massive growth of student numbers. So this is that you also shows that you can't only look at absolute numbers in funding, because it doesn't give you the full picture. Here you have those systems who have invested or disinvested in this period, so they have reduced funding starting from 2008. And also you see next to it the development of student numbers. So often you have also declining student numbers, but you have some countries where they had a student growth and declining funding. For example, Ireland is one of those countries in a very challenging situation. You will also find Estonia here in this category. I will go into a couple of more details later on. Now, lastly, I also want to show you a couple of what I would say we have found as common trends at national and European level funding, because they're very often you have the same discourses. what's very clear, even in those countries that I've showed you that have invested, but there's a strong competition for scarce resources. Higher education and research is only one part of funding through public sources, and there are lots of different other areas that have become a great priority, be it security in recent times in many systems. So this is clear an issue for almost all higher education systems, as well as at European level, where we're at the moment talking about the development of the next multi-annual financial framework. There we have the same topic, discussion about scarce resources. We also see a very strong focus on funding for efficiency. The topic of efficiency and effectiveness is popping up in the public discourse from public authorities, the demand that resources are used in an efficient way. And I think this is also part of today's discussions, because it's not as straightforward, the question of how do you use resources in an efficient and effective way. And there's a very strong link between the control, audits, and efficiency. We also have discussions on performance, on impact of the activity. So this is also what Jaak Aviksoo mentioned in the introductions. How do institutions, universities communicate to society, but also to their funders, that what they do, the teaching, research, and outreach activities have an impact. So that is becoming more and more important. And then we do have a couple of tensions that are almost inherent in the systems, which we do see also at European level funding as well as national funding. So this is the trend. You have scarce resources, so there is a trend to moving a little bit from giving grants to also using other financial instruments of getting more money into the systems. You have the tension between quantitative and qualitative control. You have a tension between simplification and financial sustainability. I'm only talking about competitive funding resources, also trying on the one hand to simplify. I'm just taking one example, flat rates. They do not cover the full cost, so there that might be simpler to use something like this. But at the same time, it has an impact on the financial sustainability if we only fund parts of the costs. And then we have this tension between national and European funding. At European level, we're spending a lot of time talking about synergies between different European funds, but also synergies between European and national funding. But it is, in reality, very, very difficult to achieve. So these are a couple of common trends. Here is some data from Estonia in a European comparison. So this is from our public funding observatory, the data that we've collected every year. And in this comparison, you see that we would classify Estonia as a declining system under pressure in the way we categorize this, meaning that if you take the funding from 2008, you can see it has been going down, particularly if you look at it in real terms, and that sort of the decline in funding has been higher than, let's say, if you check it with the student numbers. So that is certainly something that needs to be taken account of. Now, I want to move on to the part where I outline a couple of key aspects of holistic funding reforms as one of the pillars to achieve this trust and efficiency within a system. And the important part is that is actually something that no matter what kind of projects we've been doing, it comes out that in those systems where this circle of working together of the different actors, if that works, the likelihood that you manage to come to a sensible, efficient, effective system is higher than if this circular form doesn't work. So it's really about the different actors working together. So it's the institutions, the relevant public authorities, the different funding bodies, and very often, that's why it's grouped here as well, the national rectors' conferences, where they can group institutions also being often involved in reform processes. And it's also important, I've highlighted 3 points here. It's leadership commitment. These are very often not just technical issues that are discussed. Of course, that's part of it, but it is a leadership issue. So it's really important that of all the actors involved, the leadership is involved. That's one key success factor, that there is a coordinated approach and that there is a communication between these bodies. So it's really the key of developing successful reforms. Now, from the system perspective and the public authorities, we have identified from many systems that we've analyzed a couple of essential factors that lead to success. So it's first of all, if you remember the structure of the different funding sources that I've showed, it's really about finding the right balance between public funding and private funding. There is no, let's say, no figure that you can give. You have to find it for your own systems. But it starts at the beginning. Do we have the right funding mix in our system between those big sources? So it's public, the different parts of public funding, private, so contributions from business and industry, as well as tuition fees. So those are the question, have you got the right mix? Then, when we zoom into public funding, it's also the question, do you have the right mix of public funding tools available? So it's block grant funding. How does the block grant funding look? Do you have the right mix of input elements, output elements, performance elements? What's the right mix between competitive sources? This is a key question that pop up in several higher education systems. The percentage between competitive funding resources and block grant funding. So that is a key question of efficiency. Just giving you one example. If your percentage of competitive funding is too high, then the risk that the overall resources are not allocated in the most efficient way, because competitive sources have, of course, the advantage, they spur competition, but if you have, for example, success rates around between even 10 or 20%, well, then you have 80% of work done into applications that is not funded. So there you always have to find the right mix between efficiency and effectiveness, also by these different types of funding. In addition, one has to take account of that there's a high percentage of fixed costs of running universities. And the challenge, again, if it's too high on competitive basis, that particularly staff, academic staff, research staff, is hired only on, let's say, very flexible, very fluctuative contracts, that can also pose a problem in terms of the sustainability and competitiveness of the system. And then last but not least, it's also very important to ensure the synergies, as I already mentioned, between national funding and European funding. So I would also argue that it is a very important role at national level from the relevant public authorities to make a strong point in Europe that there needs to be more coherence and more synergies. But coherence doesn't mean that all national systems are pushed into one system at European level. It's rather the other way around, that European funding needs to take more account of what's happening in national systems in order to be more efficient overall. Now I want to show you a couple of examples that we have detected in our last work on looking appropriate auditing frameworks. So for example, what are national competitive research funding systems where we thought they have done something which is worth looking at? And you find, for example, Ireland, the Science Foundation in Ireland among these examples. Joan will tell you more details about that. You will find, for example, the FFG, the Austrian Research Founding Council, and the Research Council of Norway that we looked at and we thought, okay, they're doing something that's really worth looking at. And what is it that they do? Some of them accept a national developed accounting methodology that's used by all universities. So that means that the whole higher education system, universities have developed a costing methodology that is accepted by these national research funders. So there is an understanding of which costs can be funded and what are the procedures. Of course, it has a little bit of a flexibility in there, but overall, and that is something that we believe is very efficient. It also reduces the risk of errors because the different actors understand the system. So this is really something that we think is worth it. If you remember the circle of actors that I showed you, developing this somehow also together doesn't mean that all have to have the same role in it, but if everyone's somehow in the picture, part of it, there is a greater acceptance and the processes run smoother. These three research funders also do system and process audits. So rather than controlling and audit every singular transaction, they look more at the processes, and if you have systems in place that ensure an appropriate use of funds. And that is a much more modern form of, let's say, control and actually looking at improving what the actors do, then checking, let's say, if a researcher has his metro ticket that he used for travel, and you have 5 people that need to work on finding this metro ticket. I mean, it's an extreme example, but it's daily practice. Yeah? What they also do, some of these research funders, is they rely on audits from other units or other funders. And this is something that in a world where universities, and many of you experience this yourself, you basically audited all the time by different bodies, very often on the same issue. And that is simply not efficient. Of course, problematic point is, most of these funders have different rules, so they say, well, we need to check if it's done right according to our rules. And here is the main problem why this cross-reliance on audits is such a complex issue, also between national and European funders. But we have examples here how they can work in a national system. I think Joan will also talk a little bit about that. And we think as well, this is a very efficient way of saving resources, and at the same time ensuring the same aim that you have, ensuring that funds are used in an appropriate way. So here, just 3 that are worth looking at. Just a couple of points, what we think are principles of efficient and effective control. So we think it's increasing the alignment of auditing and funding frameworks. So when you think about what is the right funding mix in a system, one also needs to think about the accountability part, and that goes onto the auditing procedures, and that can manifest itself, for example, in that not all of the different actors, at least in one system, carry out their own auditing procedures. But it starts already with the alignment of rules. And I give you one example. The FFG, the Austrian Research Funding Council, I think it was 10 years ago, where they started to look at their own funding instruments when they say, well, we have to do something because we have so many different funding programs. Very many of them have very different rules and regulations, one single funder, and they said, well, this doesn't make sense. So they already started with themselves, and that is already a helpful point. Also moving towards more ex-ante system and process audits. So it's, as I said, not the transaction audit, but system and process audit. Cross-reliance with previous audits is a very important part. Conducting joint audits, that's also something I think Joan will talk about it, meaning that you're not necessarily relying on the audit of another, but you know that different funders fund the same institutions, so they work out, well, we're not auditing twice, but let's work together and how can we share actions. So it's really moving from a strict control system to actually improving. And when you look at the systems, it's what, well, simplified spoken, what you do is to ensure that you have processes in place within the institutions that ensure both the funder as well as the leadership of the institutions that the funds that are used properly. Because, and I'm coming back to the trust issue, the institution itself, particularly leadership, has a great interest that the funds, the scarce funds that the institution has, are used in an appropriate way. So very often one thinks it's the funders or public authorities and the institutions are on the other side. That's actually not the case. Everyone has an interest that you can do the most with the resources. Well, so that's the part on the system part. Now, what is the part of the institutions to show that they're trustworthy, that they are acting efficiently? And I will give you a couple of points that we have developed, and we also have a specific toolkit developed for one project, the financial management toolkit. So you have couple of 6 points. It's sort of developing an appropriate resource allocation model, an appropriate budgeting and financial planning, developing an appropriate costing model that also links about reviewing organizational structure and responsibility. So a costing model is not only a technical issue of having a costing model in place, but also looking at how the processes are put in place within an institution. It's about establishing an appropriate human resource development, because you need to have professional staff who is dealing with that. And the 6th one is developing an appropriate diversification strategy. You have here, I'm not going into too much detail of that. I can, in the Q&A session, go a little bit into some of the details, but we also have worked what are the basic steps of developing an appropriate costing model. Maybe I just zoom in here on managing the data, because that, I understand, is also a hot question on how you collect your data, and in particularly on how do you account for staff costs. Are timesheets the only way of having a justification of resources spent? We have done quite some work on that as well. The simple answer is no, it isn't. And in particularly, it might have worked 10 or 15 years ago, but today, again, remember the diversity of funding sources. There is not just 100% time of a researcher's time. because many researchers work on many different projects, and that is again very, very difficult. So you have different ways of accounting for time. We have some more details in some of our projects, but just to zoom in on that one, that's not the only way of dealing with that. Again, the question of costing methodology, I'll leave that aside for the moment. What I said, very important, developing a human resource policy, very important. You have to have the appropriate structure and staff profiles, an appropriate recruitment strategy. It also means to be efficient, to show trust, that you have staff at all levels. So I'm not talking only about leadership, but at all levels, who have appropriate training, you have project management skills, you have communication skills, who have change management skills, who can work as teams. So that is something that has also become more and more important than, let's say, 15, 20 years ago. So that's a key part. Also, do you have the right career progression pathways? And I'm not talking only about the academic staff, but also administrative staff, succession planning, etc. So very important part of that. Now, some recommendations for a student that could go further, but again, how do you establish at one part the trust and efficiency? At system level, it is really about the appropriate balance, I think, between block grant and competitive funding. To what I would say in a European comparison, there's too much, there's a too high percentage of competitive funding in the system in comparison to other higher education systems in Europe. So that would be, to my understanding, something that would be in the long-term future something to look at. The development of a costing structure certainly is worth supporting that. I understand that there has already been something done in Estonia. I remember, as I mentioned, the 2013 event we had here, so there is something happening, but I think again it requires the inclusion of national funders and the competitive funders as well. Development of appropriate audit procedures, with looking at some of the principles that I have explained, would be worth doing. And last but not least, also at national level, and that is really towards the public authorities that sit in Brussels in the different committees, you need to engage in simplification debate at European level, because that has a high impact if there is some changes at European level, and it will only come if enough national systems say, you need to become more efficient, you need to look more towards we doing rather than the other way around. 3 points at institutional level: appropriate costing system, professionalization of financial management, and the appropriate accountability systems, and that will hopefully then lead to trust and efficiency. So that was what I wanted to share with you in the time that I had, and I'm looking forward to some discussion and questions. Thank you very much.